Life can be mysterious at times, as if a higher power truly wants to demonstrate that everything that goes around, comes around. For better or for worse, today, we are going to tell the story of a man whose life was altered by a simple gesture. Every day after work, John would take the bus home. He worked in a factory, and some days were particularly grueling. He usually fell asleep on the way, and his co-workers would wake him up so he wouldn't miss his stop. But this time, he was alone and was about to end up at the final stop, resulting in a 30-minute walk back home. However, at that moment, a pleasant female voice said, "Hey, your stop is next. You're going to miss it." John opened his eyes and saw a beautiful woman next to him. "Thank you very much," he said. "But how do you know which stop is mine?" The woman smiled and said it wasn't the first time she had seen his co-workers wake him up. She lived 3 stops away from him, and apparently they both left work at similar times. John decided to stay on the bus and get off at the woman's stop while they talked. He discovered her name was Jessica, and they had a few things in common. The conversation was pleasant, and they decided to meet again the next day. The two started dating, and 8 months later John proposed to Jessica. She accepted. In love, they had a daughter a few years later named Sarah, who became the reason for their lives. The carefree childhood of the girl was disturbed because at a certain point her mother began to experience frequent symptoms of a lung disease. Jessica treated herself at home with medications that alleviated the symptoms, always postponing doctor's appointments, and this was the reason for arguments between the couple. John believed it was something simple but did not agree with Jessica's stance of not investigating further. In the end, she always convinced him with an optimistic view of her condition. If John knew where this would end, he would never have allowed Jessica to delay her appointments for so long. Some months later, the bill came. Jessica woke up feeling dizzy, but she preferred to believe it was nothing serious. She followed her morning routine normally, but 2 hours later her condition worsened and John called an ambulance. As soon as the ambulance arrived, John was reassured by the doctors who said she would be fine. Jessica went with the doctors in the ambulance and fell into a coma on the way to the hospital and was admitted directly to the ICU. On the way to the hospital, Sarah asked, "How is Mommy, Daddy? Is she going to be okay?" "Of course, she is, dear," John replied. But when they entered the hospital lobby, the nurse on duty did not let them proceed. A few minutes later, an old doctor called him, took John's hand, and said, "We're sorry, but your wife died shortly after being admitted. The condition was too advanced, her lungs were too affected, and there was nothing more we could do. Be strong." John didn't hear the doctor's last words. He left and cried in silence. Sarah came to his side. "Daddy, Daddy, why are you crying? Where's Mommy? Why did you lie to me and say she would be okay?" But John simply couldn't find the answers. After his wife's death, John did what he could to ensure a dignified life for Sarah. He worked overtime at the factory and gained the respect of his superiors. One day, on his way to work, a skinny, pale boy approached him and said, "Please, sir, I'm embarrassed to ask, but do you have any money to give me? I'm very hungry." John realized the boy was really embarrassed, which was not typical of a common beggar. The man then opened his wallet and noticed that he only had a few coins and a $20 bill. After thinking for a few seconds, he handed the note to the boy and also gave him the sandwiches that would be his lunch at the factory. "Take this, boy. I work in that factory over there. I'll figure it out. It won't be the first time. Thank you, sir. I'll pay you back," the boy said with tears in his eyes. John smiled at him and headed towards the factory. He had no idea that at that moment the boy made a promise to himself to find him and pay him back. John came home that night hungry, having only drunk water for lunch. The name of the boy who had asked for money was Bernardo, and his family situation was really difficult. His parents were alcoholics and didn't seem to care about him. 10 years passed as if they were days. John had been promoted because of his hard work and had bought a bike for Sarah. She spent the whole afternoon riding with her friends around the neighborhood, jumping ramps, skidding on the sidewalk, and one day, while racing in an alley, Sarah lost her balance and hit the curb hard. Her friends were scared when they realized that Sarah was responding but couldn't get up. Some people approached, called an ambulance, and called John, who rushed out of work. "What happened to my daughter?" John asked the doctor. "At the moment, her life is not in danger, but we have a problem. Unfortunately, the girl's spine is broken, and she probably won't be able to walk again." Noticing John's despair, he added, "Not all hope is lost. There are specialized hospitals in the capital with advanced treatments for nervous system injuries, but unfortunately, these operations are extremely expensive. Depending on the length of treatment, it can reach millions." "I have nowhere to get that money," John murmured. The doctor remained silent. A month later, Sarah was discharged. It was now up to her to learn how to move around well in a wheelchair and get accustomed to life as a person with a disability. Over the following years, John sacrificed any leisure options for himself while saving every bit of money left over after paying the bills. By this time, Sarah had become a beautiful woman. If it weren't for the wheelchair, she would have won several beauty contests. John fell into depression after failing in his attempt to raise funds for his daughter's treatment. He had simply lost faith. And when his hope had already run out, someone knocked on his door. When John opened the door, he saw a well-dressed man who appeared to be around 30 years old. "Hello, John. You probably don't recognize me," the stranger smiled. John agreed. The young man opened his wallet and there was only a $20 bill in it. He took out the bill and handed it to John. At that moment, John understood everything, looked the young man in the eye, and that ashamed look from 20 years ago had disappeared. Now the young man was there, 20 years older and radiating confidence. The young man asked if he could come in and said his name was Bernardo. At this moment, Sarah appeared in the living room in her wheelchair and smiled sweetly to greet the visitor. Bernardo was embarrassed and his face turned red on the spot, but he composed himself and asked how John was doing. The man had not forgotten how John had treated him 20 years ago, and now, after making a name for himself as a successful businessman, he decided to look for him. During this time, Bernardo had lived in the capital and only returned to the small town to fulfill a promise he had made in the past, the promise to pay the debt. He remembered that John worked at the factory and was able to get the address he needed. What he didn't expect was to find a man with serious problems and a daughter with a disability. When Bernardo heard about Sarah's physical condition and the possible solutions, he thought for a moment and said, "John, you may not know this, but many years ago, you saved me. At that time, $20 was as important to me as $200,000 or $2 million now. That's why I'm going to reimburse you proportionally and cover all the costs of Sarah's treatment." The room fell silent. John seemed incredulous. Sarah approached and hugged Bernardo. Tears welled up in the young businessman's eyes as he remembered that at 9 years old, he was asking for money from the man he could now help. 3 weeks later, after a successful surgery, Sarah took her first steps on her own. During that important event, John held her by one hand and Bernardo by the other. Bernardo fell in love with Sarah and plans to ask for her hand in marriage soon. Tears of joy ran down John's face for the first time in years, and according to him, they were much more welcome than those of sadness and longing. If you have been touched by this story in any way, please kindly show your support by subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing it with others who may also be touched. I believe you will also enjoy another story that is appearing on the screen. See you later.